With the plethora of racing games that were released on the PlayStation during its lifespan, there was many different varieties that ranged from off-road to rally, supercar, exotic racing. You had many different iterations of Formula 1 games, even kart racers. But the PlayStation was also home to a small amount of Indy 500 racing games that again would all come under different names. But they're such a rarity that most people don't even know that they exist. And they can either be hard to find, or just the names alone, they're the types of concepts that people generally would not be looking for in the grand scheme of things. But they're there, they are playable, and they do take elements from many of the other iconic games that were released on the console itself. If anything, some of the games were either released by developers of well-known and popular entries that took massive inspiration from them, but then there's also other titles that completely fall under the radar that very few have ever heard of in most regards. One of the titles we're going to be looking at here simply goes under the name of Indy 500. That was developed by the Tomy Corporation and published by JVC for the PlayStation in Japan in 1997 and would later release in Europe in 1998. Now the thing is with this game, if you go looking for this specific name on Google or even on the internet, it is very confusing because there's so many different iterations of the game that show up that were either released from the arcades or even on PC. There's so many games with just the simple name of Indy 500 that it's so confusing to a point that you can't really tell which game is which. You kind of have to dive deeper, but the problem is with that I find is that there's so very little information out there regarding most of these games that trying to find any kind of insights behind their history or development or anything is nigh on impossible. If anything, there's virtually nothing out there for a lot of these games, bar from a few gameplay videos or some screenshots. You might get an odd article here or there. Sometimes if you do find an article, it might only be a paragraph, but it doesn't really give much clarity as to the involvement or development or even the background of the game in general. So in most regards, I'm hoping that by making these videos that cover these games, it will shine some light on them to at least make them more appealing to those that would have been interested in playing them back in the day, like myself. Because like many of you, I grew up with the PlayStation. I love the console, it's my favourite console ever. And while I owned many games and played a lot of different games, and I've got to play a lot more over the last number of years since starting this channel, there have always been games that have been out of my reach, or games that I did have the chance to either buy but just didn't for different reasons. I was either buying another game or it just didn't appeal to me at that time, or there's games that I wanted you seen in magazines that you just couldn't get access to for whatever reason, and they just became lost to time. But at least now, looking back and with access to everything now, we do have that privilege of being able to play these games nowadays, which is really cool in itself. That's why I make these videos, that's why I enjoy doing this, because not only does it allow me to share that experience with you, but it also allows for the highlight of these games to be brought to the mainstream, because there is a lot of these games that people do actively still be looking for even to this day. They either can't remember the name of the game or they get confused with one game over another because again, like, they're similar names, which does put people off, so people can never really fully find the exact game that they're looking for. So by making these videos, it will bring that to them to some degree, and well, I'm hoping that it will anyway. But aside from that, getting back to the game in question, what's it like to play overall? It's a good solid experience, in fairness to it. Now, it doesn't try to do anything different or anything new. You do have a limited amount of tracks, because it does, even though it feels like a simulation racer, but it's more arcade, because there's only like a handful of tracks that are available. There's only a select few cars, pretty much they're all the same, you just change the different textures or the different sponsors or colours, and there's very little in terms of difference with regards to handling dynamics or any additional features. They're all pretty much the same. But the game is challenging. It does have good handling dynamics and physics. Like, for an early game of its type, it does do what it's supposed to do quite well. There are better racers on the system, I will admit, but the more I sat down with this, the more I enjoyed it. The races themselves aren't overly long, but you will have to put a bit of practice into the game to get the most out of it, as you can slide off the track very easily if you're not sure of what you're doing. Now, you do have a mixed variety of different types of tracks, anything from oval type layouts to more diverse tracks, even some familiar tracks that you might have used or seen that look similar to what other games you've played of a similar category. But one of the cool aspects with this here is that the weather can transition or change as the race goes on. There's one of the tracks in question that you will start off in the qualifying and it's lashing rain, but then when you go into the race it looks like it's all dried up, but then you go on to the second or third lap in the race and then it starts raining. So that completely changes up the whole dynamic of how the car interacts with the environment, as you can slide around corners runners a lot easier, you don't have the same level of grip, and it can be harder to see what's going on the screen, so it does have a lot of realistic elements to it. And the graphics ain't half bad either. Compared to a lot of other racing games, the graphics are quite solid in this, in all fairness to it. But it will take a bit of time to pick up and play, and just to get familiar with the whole control system in question. But once you do that, you will have a good experience, and it's definitely one of the more solid racers of this type that I've played so far on the console, in fairness to it. But just the lack of tracks and the lack of variety won't keep you engaged for long, as there are other games of a similar type. While there aren't that many Indy 500 games, well, when I think about it, there is quite a few, you just don't hear about them. You have the likes of Newman Haas Racing, there's Kart World Series, and a few other games that I can think of. There's even Andretti Racing as well. I have covered them in previous videos, so I'll leave links to all of them in the description. And they all present different types of experiences. There's no one any really different than the other though in saying what they represent, but just the gameplay and the overall handling characteristics and even some of the visual elements are different. But what the game is trying to do, if you've played one Indy 500 game, it's like the Formula 1 games. If you played one, chances are you've pretty much played them all, because they all try to do a very similar thing. But then I can say the same about other types of sports games with the likes of football, basketball, golf. They all do very similar things, they just put their own spin on it, and this game does exactly the same. But I have to say now, I did enjoy this, and I found it to be a lot better than I originally would have thought. If anything, out of all the Indy 500 games that I have played on the console, I definitely consider it to be one of the better experiences. Yes, there is very little information that can be found online about this game, because, like I said, when you do go searching for it, very little about the PlayStation version of this particular game shows up. You always get loads of different articles around games that were released on the PC or other consoles, which can completely throw you off. So the best way for me to tell you what the game is like is that you would have to experience it for yourself. You make your own decisions on whether you like it or not. But I found it to be an enjoyable experience and one of the better games of this type, but I'll leave that up to you. But in the meantime, I would love to know your thoughts on this if you have played the game yourself and what you think of it overall. Did you find this to be a solid experience, or do you enjoy Indy 500 games in general, or even Formula 1 games, especially back during this generation of consoles? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other types of racing games similar to this that were also released on the PlayStation, then you can check out the playlist on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.